What happens when the quiet secretary in the corner, the one no one ever notices, finally refuses to stay silent? In the frozen hills of North Carolina, Eleanor Nora Whitfield had perfected the art of being invisible. For years, she kept the hospital running with notes, binders, and midnight calls, all while the new Millionaire CEO, Grant Mercer, dismissed her as background noise. To him, efficiency was king, and human need was a line item. But what happens when efficiency collides with the fragile breath of an elderly patient stranded on an icy road? What happens when dignity itself is treated as a luxury? This is a story about courage that begins not with a speech, but with a paper cup of burnt coffee spilling across a white shirt. It is about 10 days that changed a hospital, a community, and two people who discovered that respect can be rebuilt, but only if the truth is finally spoken aloud. Will Nora risk everything she has to protect those who have no voice? And will Grant learn that arrogance cannot shield him from the grief he has tried to forget? If you believe stories like this matter, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Now, let's begin. The hospital always stirred before the sun. Its rhythm was steady, like an old clock that never stopped ticking, even when the town around it slept under a quilt of snow. Outside, the Blue Ridge Mountains lay in heavy silence. Icy switchbacks curled around ridges, and the headlights of the occasional ambulance traced thin ribbons of light against the darkness. Eleanor Whitfield, who most people simply called Nora, arrived at the same time every morning. She parked in the farthest corner of the lot, not because spaces were scarce, but because she preferred the long walk across the crisp morning air. That quiet stretch gave her a few moments to gather herself. The breath she released looked like smoke rising in the cold. Her boots crunched against ice-salted pavement as she carried her scuffed leather planner pressed close to her chest. In her other hand, she held a styrofoam cup of cafeteria coffee. It smelled bitter, overbrewed, but it was the anchor that began her day. Inside, the hospital lights hummed softly. The halls smelled faintly of antiseptic and old paint. Nurses coming off night shifts nodded in passing, their eyes glazed with fatigue. Nora offered a small smile each time, though she knew by now most would forget they'd seen her. That was how she existed here, always present, rarely noticed. Her office was not really an office at all. It was a desk outside the suite of the new CEO, a fortress of glass and polished wood. From her chair she managed the schedules, the calls, the endless stream of emails that arrived at all hours. She prepared board packets and cross-checked numbers until her eyes burned. She collected concerns from nurses, community volunteers, and even church groups who ferried elderly patients through mountain roads. She logged them carefully in her planner, highlighted them, summarized them, and placed them in neat binders. No one ever opened the binders. The hospital had recently hired Grant Mercer, a man who arrived from Boston with an immaculate resume and a reputation for saving struggling institutions. He was younger than most CEOs, not yet in his mid-40s, but already carried himself with the sharp precision of someone used to command. His suits were tailored, his shoes unscuffed, his tone brisk. He spoke of consolidation, of efficiency, of turning deficits into surpluses. His first presentation dazzled with sleek slides full of bold arrows and clean graphs. Telehealth was the cornerstone of his plan, a vision of doctors on screens reaching across miles of mountain roads. It was not unwise in theory, but to Nora it felt incomplete. For every elderly patient without reliable internet, for every winter storm that knocked down power lines, she saw gaps wide enough to swallow lives. The worst cut was the proposal to close the overnight emergency coverage and cardiac rehab. The town's retirees leaned on those services like a walking stick. Without them, too many would stumble. Nora thought of the old man who came twice a week for cardiac rehab after open-heart surgery. She thought of the woman whose husband relied on midnight ambulance runs. Their names filled her notes, but none appeared on the glossy slides. At the first board session with Grant, Nora sat in the corner, as usual. The 12 members listened in silence, their expressions neutral, as he paced at the head of the long mahogany table. His voice was calm, confident. He promised stability within a year if his plan moved forward without delay. Nora had placed her binder at the edge of the table, a careful summary of community needs drawn from surveys, church records, and staff interviews. The pages held the voices of the town, the veterans who worried about longer drives, the single caregivers who begged for more support, the neighbors who counted minutes waiting for ambulances on icy roads. She had checked the figures 3 times, highlighted the winter patterns, and left sticky notes for quick reference. No one opened it. Instead, one of the executives nudged it aside to make room for Grant's laptop. The binder slid across the polished surface until it rested against a water glass. Nora watched the small motion with a heaviness that pressed against her chest. Grant clicked to the next slide, where a bright arrow pointed to cost savings overnight ER reduction. His voice did not waver. He did not look at her desk. She felt invisible, though the sting was sharp. It was not the first time her work had been dismissed, but something about the smooth confidence in his tone, the way he didn't pause for questions, scraped deeper. Her hand tightened around her pen. She wrote a single line in her planner, 10 days until review. The state health authority would be visiting in less than 2 weeks. Bond rating officers would follow. If the hospital appeared unstable, funding would slip. If the plan moved forward as presented, the community would suffer. Either way. The countdown ticked louder. Nora sat through the rest of the meeting in silence. She kept her expression calm, but inside she was cataloging every risk, every overlooked detail. She imagined icy roads on a February night, an ambulance delayed, a monitor flatlining in the back. She imagined the board smiling at numbers while families sat waiting in chapel pews. When the meeting ended, the members filed out, leaving behind empty coffee cups and the faint scent of cologne. Grant closed his laptop with brisk efficiency. Nora stayed seated for a moment longer, staring at her untouched binder. Her planner lay open to the week ahead. She underlined the words 10 days twice, the ink pressing deep enough to mark the next page. As she gathered her things, the question settled in her chest like frost. What would it take to finally stop being polite? People praised the new plan with words that sounded polished but hollow. They admired the graphs, the neat percentages, the way Grant Mercer could speak for 20 minutes without a single pause. To Nora, it was like watching a crowd cheer for a house built on sand. In the days that followed, department heads repeated Grant's language almost word for word. They spoke of efficiency, of lean operations, of savings that will strengthen the hospital's future. Not once did anyone mention the steep roads where ambulances fishtailed in ice. No one spoke of the fragile web of neighbors and church vans that kept patients moving from Hollow to town. Nora sat quietly at her desk outside Grant's office, typing minutes, updating call sheets, and filing reports. The hum of the copier blended with the buzz of fluorescent lights. She looked up from her planner often, listening for any hint that someone might question the risks. But the only voices she heard were echoes of his. Carol Hensley, the head nurse, stopped by one afternoon. Her shoulders sagged from a 12-hour night shift. She carried a clipboard full of incident reports. Carol didn't bother lowering her voice. "We're spread too thin at night," she said, dropping the stack on Nora's desk. 2 code blues last week, with only 3 nurses on duty. We're asking for mistakes to happen. Nora flipped through the pages, her eyes catching on words like fatigue, delayed response, and staffing gap. She logged them carefully in her planner under the label urgent. She used red ink for the first time this month. When Carol left, Nora stared at the list. She imagined how easily a tired hand could miss a dosage, how quickly a weary step could stumble in the ER. These weren't numbers. They were lives balanced on too few shoulders. She tucked the pages into a folder marked Community Concerns, the same folder that never left her desk. The calendar on her wall reminded her of the upcoming donor luncheon. The event was always dressed in linen and polite conversation. This year, the tension was sharper. Retirees had caught wind of the proposal to close cardiac rehab. For them, it was not a budget line. It was the difference between walking in a wheelchair, between breath and silence. Whispers traveled fast in a small town. Nora overheard two elderly visitors in the hallway one morning. "If they close that rehab, I'm done for." One man muttered, "I can't drive to Charlotte twice a week." His wife patted his arm, but her eyes looked wet. Nora wanted to tell them she had raised these concerns. She wanted to promise she was fighting for them. Instead, she lowered her head and kept walking. Her words were trapped in the margins of her notes, where no one looked. She began to rehearse sentences in her mind. On her drive through the dark mountain roads each morning, she imagined herself speaking in the boardroom. She pictured her voice steady, pointing out the flaws, offering solutions. By the time she parked, her heart would race with the thought of finally being heard. But when the moment came, her throat closed. At the weekly operations meeting, Grant outlined staffing changes while executives nodded. Nora cleared her throat. "Prepared to raise Carol's reports," she managed to say. "I believe there are concerns about the chair of the meeting," cut her off with a brisk wave. "We'll come back to operations minutiae later. Let's stay at the strategic level." Laughter rippled softly around the table, polite and dismissive. Heat rose up Nora's neck. She pressed her lips together and lowered her eyes to the notepad in front of her. Her hands trembled slightly as she wrote the word minutiae in the margin. Then she underlined it 3 times. The humiliation sat heavy on her chest. It was subtle, almost invisible, but it stung more than open cruelty. To be told that lives and risks were minutiae left her hollow. She forced herself to keep typing notes as if nothing had happened. That night, at her aunt's small kitchen table, Nora opened her planner again. She circled the date of the State Health Authority review. 10 days. The ink pressed deep into the paper. Below it, she wrote a single line, "If not now." When the question lingered in the quiet kitchen, outside, wind scraped branches against the window. Nora wrapped her hands around a cooling mug of tea, the bitter taste sharp on her tongue. She closed her eyes, rehearsing once more the words she still couldn't say. The 10-day clock ticked louder. A single head shake and a sea of nods was all it took. Nora hadn't even realized she had done it. The motion was small, almost invisible, more a reflex than an act of defiance. But in a room where everyone nodded along to every slide, the quiet shake of her head stood out like a flare. The boardroom lights were dimmed, a projector humming as Grant Mercer paced at the front. His deck was flawless, slide after slide, bright with color, sharp with numbers, flowed across the screen, efficiency gains, cost savings, scalable telehealth. His voice carried the assurance of someone used to obedience. He spoke of smoother operations, of trimming redundancies. His language was clean, his tone precise. But to Nora, sitting along the wall with her notepad balanced on her lap, the gaps were glaring. He never mentioned the mountain switchbacks where an ambulance could take 40 minutes to reach a farmhouse. He did not talk about the fragile chain of church vans that carried elderly patients when public transit stopped running. He didn't touch on Medicare choke points delays and coverage approvals that meant people waited too long to seek care. Nora had spent evenings mapping those gaps. She had traced routes with a red pen, noting which roads iced first in January storms. She had called local pastors, recording the patchwork networks that filled holes in official transport. She had highlighted Medicare appeals that dragged on until it was too late. All of it sat in the binder she carried into the meeting, a binder that no one reached for. Grant clicked to a slide titled Projected Surplus. The numbers marched neatly across the screen. He was mid-sentence when Nora's head moved, just the faintest shake. "Something wrong, Ms. Whitfield?" one board member asked lightly, his voice cutting through the silence. His smile was polite, but sharp around the edges. Heat prickled across her face. She straightened her shoulders, searching for words. But Grant spoke first. "I'm sure Eleanor is keeping us on track," he said, with a faint chuckle. "She knows all the operational minutiae better than anyone." The laughter was soft, but enough. Her credentials, her degree, her months of research shrunk to a single word minutiae. She forced her lips into a thin smile, though her throat ached. Her eyes slid to the road map she had placed at the end of the table. Its edges curled slightly from use. Bright lines of red and blue traced the switchbacks she had studied so carefully. No one touched it. No one asked. The glossy slides on the screen drew all the attention, and her map might as well have been invisible. She lowered her gaze to her notepad, pressing her pen so hard the paper nearly tore. She wrote, 10 days. The words looked stark against the lined page. Each time she wrote them, the clock grew louder in her mind. The meeting moved on, proposals were discussed, projections were praised. She heard words like growth potential and long-term viability. None of it addressed the elderly woman who lived 10 miles up a road that often closed in snow, or the veteran waiting for an appeal to be processed before scheduling rehab. Her chest felt tight. She imagined the voices she had gathered from surveys and late-night phone calls, voices now silenced by polished graphs. She thought of Carol's reports, stacked on her desk. She thought of the couple in the hallway, worrying about losing cardiac rehab. And all the while, she remained the secretary. As the projector buzzed and slides changed, Nora's mind filled with images that didn't belong in this room of glass and polished wood. She saw headlights swaying along icy roads. She heard the soft creak of a pew where families waited for news. She felt the weight of an untouched binder in her hands. When the meeting adjourned, the board members rose smoothly, their suits rustling like pressed leaves. They filed out with polite chatter, praising the clarity of the presentation. No one looked at her binder. No one asked about her notes. Nora stayed seated a moment longer. She stared at the roadmap, its lines vivid under the harsh overhead light. She thought of all the hours she had poured into it, the roads she had driven in her old sedan, stopping to time how long it took to reach the hospital, the conversations with neighbors who told her, quietly, of fears they didn't voice in public. Her hand reached for the paper cup beside her, still warm from the cafeteria machine. She tightened her grip, feeling the thin plastic lid bend slightly under her fingers. Something inside her shifted, not loudly, not with drama, but with the quiet weight of a bridge under too much strain. The 10-day clock ticked on, steady and merciless. When politeness failed, hot coffee spoke. The meeting had ended in a shuffle of papers and the squeak of leather shoes against the polished floor. Nora rose slowly, her notepad clutched in one hand, the other gripping the thin paper cup she'd carried in with her. The hallway outside the boardroom carried its own scent, sharp aftershave lingering on coats, the faint burn of a printer working overtime. Grant walked ahead, his stride measured, his shoulders squared as though the room still belonged to him. He already had his phone in hand, his gaze flicking to the screen, fingers moving fast. He didn't glance back. Nora's chest felt tight, but her steps quickened. She reached the center of the hall just as he passed the bank of elevators, light glinting off the glass doors. The murmur of voices drifted from offices nearby, but the air around her seemed suddenly too still. Her hand moved before her mind caught up. The coffee tilted. The thin plastic lid gave way with a soft crack. A dark stream spilled forward, soaking into white cotton. It spread fast, an ugly stain blossoming across Grant's immaculate shirt. The liquid dripped down his tie, slid toward the floor, and splattered onto polished shoes. The hallway froze. Conversation stopped. The elevators reflected astonished faces. 2 interns with wide eyes, a nurse carrying files, a custodian leaning on his mop. Every one of them stared at the scene as if time had stuttered. The smell of burnt roast rose heavy in the air, stronger now that it had escaped the cup. It clung to the shirt, to the marble floor, to the back of Nora's throat. Her breath was steady for the first time in days. Her heart raced, but her hands did not tremble. The cup was empty, light in her grasp. She set it down on a side table with deliberate care, the sound of paper against wood sharp in the silence. Grant stood motionless. Coffee clung to him, dripping slow, 1 drop at a time, each impact loud in the hush. His expression shifted only slightly. Shock flickering first, then something unreadable, like a man calculating a problem he had never expected to solve. He looked at her, really looked at her, as if seeing her for the first time. Nora met his gaze. For once, she didn't look away. 4 years of swallowed words pressed against her ribs, and with a single reckless act, they had all been released. She felt the bridge behind her collapse in flames. There was no path back to silence. A whisper started down the hall. Someone let out a soft gasp. A door opened, then quickly shut. The air felt charged, heavy with a story already sprinting ahead. By the end of the day, everyone in the hospital would know. By tomorrow, the town would hum with it. Still, Grant did not shout. He did not curse. He did not order security. He simply studied her. His blue eyes narrowed, his jaw tense but not clenched. It was as though he were measuring a new equation, one that unsettled even him. Nora inhaled deeply, her lungs filling with the bitter scent of coffee and adrenaline. She had done it. She had crossed a line she could never uncross. Oddly, she felt lighter. The fear she expected never came. Grant slipped his phone into his pocket and adjusted his tie with slow precision, though the fabric was ruined. He nodded once, barely perceptible, then said quietly, "Give me a moment." His voice was calm, almost too calm. He turned toward his office, his footsteps leaving faint prints on the marble as coffee dripped from his cuffs. The glass doors closed behind him, sealing the scene. Nora stood rooted to the floor, her pulse thrumming in her ears. Around her, the hallway slowly came back to life. A whisper here, a stifled laugh there, the shuffle of people suddenly busy with anything but looking directly at her. She picked up her notepad, its pages smudged where her damp fingers touched. She tucked it under her arm, squared her shoulders, and walked back toward her desk. Every step felt deliberate, heavy, but free. The air still smelled of burnt coffee. The story was already out of her hands. Rumors had taken flight. But for the first time, she didn't care. Instead of punishment, he offered a proposition. When Grant called her into his office after the coffee incident, Nora braced for dismissal. She expected the clipped formality of a termination, perhaps even the silent signing of paperwork that would erase 4 years of effort. What she did not expect was an offer that felt more like a gamble than a sentence. 10 days, he said, standing behind his desk, his shirt still faintly stained, though he had swapped jackets. No walls, no hierarchy. Work with me directly. Show me what you believe I've missed. If you prove it, we'll reshape the plan together. If you can't, you walk away with the best recommendation I can write. The words hung in the air like a dare. Nora's first instinct was disbelief. 10 days was nothing, especially when state officials and bond reviewers were set to arrive by the end of it. But the stakes had already been circling her like hawks. If the plan went forward untouched, lives would suffer. If she left now, her silence would haunt her. She thought of Carol's weary face, of the couple in the hallway whispering about losing rehab, of the survey pages in her planner marked urgent. All of them deserved more than her pride. Her voice was steady when she answered. What does that look like? Grant's gaze did not waver. Direct access. No filters. We go into the field. Ambulance runs, night shifts, community meetings. I want raw data, not polished binders. You'll walk me through it. I'll test it. Together, we'll see if your concerns hold. The list sounded less like a proposal and more like a gauntlet. Nora realized he wasn't offering charity. He was setting terms that required her to risk everything: her time, her composure, her belief in herself. And if I fail, she asked, then you'll know you tried, and I'll know you had the courage to make me listen. His tone was even, not cruel. There was something in it, an edge of curiosity, perhaps even respect that unsettled her more than anger would have. She nodded once. The choice had already been made in her heart. She could not walk away. Not yet. That night. At her aunt's kitchen table. Nora opened her planner. She turned to a clean page and wrote at the top, in neat block letters, 10-day trial. Beneath it, she made columns. One for field visits. One for risks documented. One for outcomes needed. The page filled with careful ink, her pen moving steadily as if clarity could be built line by line. She wrote ground rules for herself, a quiet manifesto. clarity. Say the thing. Even when her voice wanted to shrink. Respect. Demand it, and offer it even when the air turned sharp. Speed, no delays, every hour counted. She underlined each word twice, pressing hard enough that the marks indented the next page. The stakes circled her thoughts as she wrote. This was no academic exercise. Careers hung in the balance, not only hers, but the man across the desk, whose reputation had carried him from Boston to these mountains. The hospital's survival depended on numbers aligning with compassion, on proving to officials that efficiency could coexist with dignity. And beneath it all, elders and families waited, relying on decisions made in rooms they would never enter. She closed the planner gently, her hand resting on the worn leather cover. For once, she did not feel invisible. The path ahead was narrow, uncertain, but it was hers to walk. The following morning, she arrived before dawn as usual. The halls were quiet, machines humming softly, night nurses trading reports. She carried her planner and a fresh cup of coffee. Grant was already there, his office light glowing against the glass. He wore a new shirt, crisp and clean, as if yesterday's stain had been erased. But when he looked up, his eyes carried the weight of the bargain they had struck. Day one, he said simply. Nora nodded. She expected to begin with spreadsheets, with email drafts, with another polished deck. Instead, he gestured toward the elevator. We're starting with an ambulance ride. Her breath caught. She thought of icy roads curling through the mountains, of the red pen lines she had drawn across her map. Now she would have to show him in real time what those numbers meant. How minutes stretched when snow closed a pass. How frail lungs fought for breath while tires slipped. This was no longer about binders or boardrooms. The trial would be lived on the ground, among patients and staff, where silence could not hide the truth. She tightened her grip on her planner. The bridge behind her was gone, but before her lay a road she could no longer avoid. Truth revealed itself in odd places on roads where tires slipped, and in basements where pews overflowed. Day one began in the back of an ambulance. Nora slid onto the bench seat, her planner clutched against her chest, while Grant sat opposite, hands folded neatly, his expression unreadable. The driver nodded a greeting before turning the ignition. The siren was off, but the radio crackled with distant calls. It was just past 5 in the morning, still black outside. Frost covered the windshield until the heater began to bite through. As they pulled out, the tires hissed against salted pavement. The route wound upward into the hills. Nora kept count of the minutes, glancing at the small clock above the dash. 5 minutes to the first curve, 10 before the road narrowed. At 15, they reached a sharp switchback, tires skidding slightly before catching again. She pointed silently to the snowbank, still crusted from last week's storm. Ambulance got stuck here 2 winters ago, she said softly. 45-minute delay. Grant nodded but didn't reply. His eyes stayed fixed on the road ahead. At minute 20, the call came. An elderly woman with chest pain needed transport. The driver swung onto a side road, rough and narrow. Snow flurries still clung to the ditches, though the pavement was mostly clear. Nora felt the lurch in her stomach as the vehicle slowed to crawl over the uneven stretch. By the time they reached the farmhouse, the woman's breathing was shallow, her lips tinged gray. Paramedics worked quickly, loading her onto the stretcher, threading IV lines with practiced speed. Grant stepped back, his crisp jacket brushing the doorframe, eyes following every move. The ride back was faster, siren wailing now, minutes stretched taut. Nora watched the clock again, her pen scratching notes across a page in her lap, 28 minutes out. 34, back with siren. She underlined it twice. The woman gasped for air all the way to the hospital. By the time they arrived, color had just begun to return to her cheeks. Nora exhaled shakily, realizing she had been holding her breath. Grant met her eyes across the stretcher. He didn't speak, but something in his gaze shifted. The numbers on his slides had just grown a face. Day 2 carried them not into sterile halls, but into the warmth of a church basement. Pastor Jim greeted Nora with a bear hug, then extended a firm handshake to Grant. "We've got extra casseroles if you're hungry," he said, ushering them inside. The room smelled of baked cheese and instant coffee. Long tables stretched across the space, covered in mismatched tablecloths. Elderly women unpacked pill organizers, while teenagers stacked folding chairs. On one wall hung a corkboard plastered with sign-up sheets, meal deliveries, driver shifts, blood pressure clinics. Nora walked Grant through the system. "When the hospital can't cover, the churches do," she explained. "Transportation, meals, wellness checks. It's patchwork, but it holds." Grant scanned the sheets, his brow furrowing. "This isn't scalable," he said. "No," Nora replied quietly, "but it's survival." They sat at a folding table while Pastor Jim handed them steaming plates. Nora pointed out the volunteers retirees who drove night routes, young mothers who swapped childcare so neighbors could attend appointments, veterans who organized medication lists. She explained the rhythm of winter spikes, the lag in Medicare approvals, the toll of caregiver fatigue. Grant listened, asking sharp questions. How many missed appointments? What percentage ended up back in the ER? Nora answered steadily, her notes ready, her memory sharper. For once, her words did not vanish into silence. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, scanning the papers she slid across. Then, with a small nod, he asked, "May I see your binder?" Her chest tightened. She reached into her bag and placed the worn leather volume on the table. For months it had sat unopened in meetings, brushed aside in favor of glossy decks. Now, he turned each page with quick efficiency, his eyes moving fast, lips pressed thin in concentration. She watched him absorb the data she had collected with such care. For the first time, she saw him not as the man behind a desk, but as someone capable of reassembling the truth into something usable. By day 3, respect had begun to settle between them, not soft or sentimental, but practical, like two craftsmen acknowledging the other's tools. They stood side by side in a small conference room, a whiteboard before them. Grant drew boxes and arrows. Nora filled in routes and staffing notes. Together they sketched the outline of a pivot plan: keep the overnight ER open, launch mobile clinics on predictable routes, partner with churches for wellness hubs, use telehealth as a bridge, not a replacement. The air smelled faintly of dry erase markers, papers spread across the table, coffee cooled in paper cups nearby. But the moment of balance cracked when Nora mentioned Mrs. Douglas, a neighbor who had missed her ride last winter. The delay nearly cost her breath. "She waited almost an hour," Nora said, voice low. "By the time she reached us, her oxygen levels were—" She stopped, remembering the blue tint of the woman's lips. Grant set down his marker slowly. His jaw tightened. He wrote one word on the board, fatal. Then he circled it twice. The numbers had collided with another face. As evening settled, they stood in silence, the whiteboard filled with rough lines and calculations. The plan was only a sketch, fragile as chalk, but it was real. "We'll need cost models," Grant said at last. "I'll pull them tonight," Nora answered. She gathered her planner, its pages heavy with new notes. Her hand brushed the indentations from her earlier rules. Clarity, respect, speed. She had followed them. For once, he had listened. But outside the conference room, resistance was beginning to stir. Nora could feel it in the glances of staff who passed, in the hushed tones that hushed further when she entered. Change never moved quietly, especially when it threatened the old order. She capped her pen and looked at the whiteboard one last time. Tomorrow, the pushback would come. They set aside the perfect slides and turned to chalk lines, rough but real. The fourth day began with a fresh whiteboard, empty except for a single heading, bridge plan. The air smelled faintly of markers and stale coffee. Papers were stacked in uneven piles across the table, some dog-eared, some dotted with crumbs from sandwiches eaten on the run. Nora stood with her planner open, jotting ideas as fast as they came. Grant moved between the board and the window, his tie loosened, sleeves rolled back. Their voices overlapped in rhythm, building something neither had expected to share. Piece by piece, the plan took form. First, the overnight ER. It would stay open, staffed with fewer but better supported personnel. Grant wrote the words in thick black letters, ER preserved. Second, mobile clinics. 2 vans, retrofitted and staffed by rotating teams, would run scheduled routes through the mountain hollows. Predictable, Nora insisted. People trust what they can count on. Third, community wellness hubs. Local churches would provide space for blood pressure checks, medication reviews, and nutrition workshops. Nora described Pastor Jim's volunteers, their pill organizers lined up like soldiers. Last, telehealth. It would remain, but as support rather than replacement, bridge, not crutch, she said. Grant underlined it. When they stepped back, the board was crowded with arrows and boxes. The lines were crooked, smudged by the side of Grant's hand. But for the first time, the plan looked like it could breathe. The pushback came quickly. At the budget review, Tom Beck leaned forward, tapping his pen against a thick packet of spreadsheets. These vans expensive. Insurance won't reimburse most of it. And keeping the ER overnight adds 6 figures a year. His tone was flat, but his eyes sharp. Grant folded his arms. Cheaper than lawsuits or funerals. Tom scoffed. That's dramatic. Nora spoke before she could stop herself. It's reality. Her voice was steady, though her pulse jumped. We saw a patient nearly lose her life waiting for transport. Numbers don't erase that. The room fell silent. Tom flipped a page, irritation flashing across his face. Even if I agreed, where do we cut? Show me the offset. Grant picked up a marker and walked to the whiteboard. He crossed out lobby renovation with a thick red slash. We don't need polished tile when the ER is freezing at night. Every dollar shifts to what keeps people alive. Tempers heated, but the argument carved space for truth. Tom's spreadsheets revealed blind spots, old contracts draining funds, maintenance delayed until it cost more in repairs. Under pressure, Nora and Grant found ways to trim without gutting. The plan grew leaner, harder, stronger. By day 5, the focus shifted to donors. The round table took place in the hospital's small conference hall. Tablecloths hid folding tables. Pitchers of water lined the center. Around the room sat men and women whose names carried weight in Asheville retired executives, business owners, civic leaders. Their donations had kept the hospital afloat through lean years. Nora's palms sweated as she stood to speak. She had written notes, but the faces before her blurred them away. So, she spoke from memory, from life. She described the icy roads at dawn, the caregiver chains that broke under strain, the missed ride that nearly ended in tragedy. She told them about Pastor Jim's basement, about casseroles and pill bottles lined in neat rows. These are not luxuries, she said softly. They're lifelines. If we close the overnight ER, if we pull back services, we are not saving money. We are choosing who gets to survive winter. The room was silent when she sat down. Her hands trembled, but Grant's voice picked up smoothly, anchoring her words in numbers. He outlined cost offsets, reallocation of capital funds, projected savings from reduced readmissions. His tone was firm, each point a plank laid across the fragile bridge she had built. For the first time, the donors looked not just convinced, but moved. One man, a gray-haired former banker who had opposed the ER, cleared his throat. I'll pledge support on one condition. Keep the ER open through this winter. No exceptions. Nora's breath caught. The words felt like a hand reaching out across the gap. She nodded silently, grateful beyond speech. Day 6 ended late. The whiteboard was cluttered, markers nearly dry. Papers were scattered across the table, half-empty cups leaving rings on the wood. The hallway outside was dark, most staff long gone. Nora stayed behind, erasing stray notes, straightening piles, stacking binders in neat rows. Her planner lay open, filled with ink and arrows, the word bridge written at the top of every page. Grant stood quietly at the window, city lights flickering against the glass. He said nothing, but when she placed the last marker in its tray, he turned. Their eyes met in a silence that felt like acknowledgement, like gratitude not yet spoken aloud. She smiled faintly, then looked away, busying herself with the last stack of papers. It was easier that way. But outside the circle of light they had built, shadows were lengthening, staff whispers sharpened into something harsher. Hallway glances lingered longer, and that evening, a blurred photo began to circulate. Two figures at a whiteboard, heads bent close, shoulders nearly touching. By morning, it would carry captions they could not control. It took only one rumor to unravel a week of honest work. By the seventh morning, Nora felt the shift the moment she stepped into the cafeteria. Conversations hushed when she passed. Forks clinked too loudly against plates. She caught fragments too fast. Why her unrealistic? A pair of nurses leaned close over their coffee, eyes darting toward her before slipping away. She carried her tray to an empty table and sat alone. The eggs on her plate cooled untouched. She flipped open her planner, hoping the familiar weight of its pages would steady her. But even ink couldn't drown the sting of side eyes and whispers. The old invisibility, once suffocating, now seemed safer than this unwanted light. By mid-morning, the first email arrived. Paige Larkin, a reporter with a reputation for digging into scandals, sent a message marked urgent. Her questions were sharp, each one framed like an accusation. Sources indicate irregular practices and recent planning. Can you comment? Can you confirm or deny reports of a personal relationship influencing leadership decisions? The words made Nora's stomach twist. She stared at the glowing screen, her fingers frozen over the keyboard. Every sentence she thought to type sounded defensive, weak. She closed the laptop instead, pressing her palms against its cool surface as if it might steady her racing pulse. The board meeting that afternoon offered no relief. As Grant spoke, walking them through the latest version of the bridge plan, Nora noticed the subtle movements around the table. A board member glanced at his phone, typed quickly, then slid it face down. Another leaned sideways, whispering before covering her mouth with a hand. Even Martha, usually steady as stone, looked tired as she watched the shifting attention of her colleagues. Donors, too, were restless. In the margins of side conversations, Nora overheard doubts as governance slipped, too much power concentrated, optics matter. It no longer seemed to matter that they had preserved the ER, or that mobile clinics now had tentative pledges. The air was thick with suspicion, and suspicion spread faster than truth. That evening, in the quiet of her small office, Nora opened her planner. She stared at the page where she had written clarity, respect, speed. Her pen hovered, but no new notes came. She felt hollow, as if the ink itself had dried inside her. She remembered the long months when no one noticed her, when she was just the secretary typing call sheets. Back then, her voice had felt invisible, but her integrity had been intact. Now, her ideas had been heard, yet every achievement seemed tainted by whispers of favoritism. The weight of it pressed so hard against her chest, she could hardly breathe. Then came the photo. Late at night, her phone buzzed with a message from a colleague. No words, just an image attached, a blurred snapshot, taken through glass, of her and Grant standing at a whiteboard. Their shoulders leaned close, heads bent toward the same page. The caption beneath was cruel, mocking her rise as something earned not by work, but by implication. Nora's hand shook as she set the phone down. Her face burned, though no one was there to see it. She looked around the room, at the neat stacks of binders, the rows of notes pinned to the wall, the planner spread open with pages full of months of work, all of it reduced, in one cruel frame, to gossip. She pressed her forehead into her hands, a low breath leaving her chest. For the first time in years, she wished for the safety of being unseen. Morning came heavy, gray skies hanging low over Asheville. Nora dressed slowly, her fingers fumbling with buttons. She arrived at the hospital earlier than usual, hoping to slip inside unnoticed. But as she stepped into the lobby, she saw Paige Larkin waiting. The reporter stood tall, notepad in one hand, microphone in the other. Her eyes locked on Nora instantly. The whispers of the staff had sharpened into something louder. Now, the storm was waiting in plain sight. Truth hates microphones. So does dignity. The sliding glass doors opened, letting in the cold air of an Asheville morning. Nora stepped into the lobby, hoping for a quiet walk to the elevator. Instead, she found Paige Larkin waiting, pen poised over a notepad, microphone already angled toward her. "Ms. Whitfield," Paige called, voice sharp enough to carry across the tiled floor. "Do you have a comment on allegations of irregular practices?" The lobby froze. Colleagues who had been walking toward the elevators slowed, suddenly absorbed in their phones. A nurse leaned against the counter, scrolling too deliberately. A clerk bent to tie a shoe that didn't need tying. Everyone listened, though no one admitted it. Nora's heart thudded against her ribs. She forced her shoulders back, but her hands clutched her planner too tightly. Paige's questions came fast, each one shaped like a verdict. Did your proximity to Mr. Mercer influence the decision to keep the ER open? Were donors misled about governance? Is it true you've bypassed chain of command and critical planning? Each word stung. Each pause left space for silence to sound like guilt. "I have no comment," Nora said, her voice steadier than she felt. She tried to walk past, but Paige stepped closer, her heels clicking sharply against the marble. "Sources suggest favoritism." Paige pressed. "Do you deny it? Or is silence confirmation?" Nora stopped. She looked at the reflection of herself in the glass wall, hair pulled neatly back, coat buttoned, planner pressed like a shield to her chest. She looked like someone she hardly knew, a woman trapped between truth and perception. The air felt heavy. She could sense the way reputations shifted in real time, colleagues adjusting their opinions without words. Each second of hesitation seemed to write a story she could not edit. By afternoon, the boardroom held the weight of that morning's scene. Tom Beck spoke with the practiced calm of someone feeding a fire while pretending to carry water. "Optics matter," he reminded the group. "Even strong plans can collapse under poor perception. Donors need confidence, not controversy." Martha frowned but said little. Texts buzzed quietly along the table. A donor representative cleared her throat. "Perhaps the pledge for the ER should be paused until things settle. We can't risk reputational damage." The words landed like a stone in Nora's chest. Everything she had fought for, the overnight ER, the vans, the hubs, suddenly felt fragile as glass. She sat quietly at the edge of the room, her notepad untouched, her voice absent. She could not trust herself to speak without breaking. When the meeting ended, Nora walked past the cafeteria, past her desk, past the noise of staff whispering in corners. Her feet carried her into the small hospital chapel. The room was dim, sunlight filtered through frosted glass. Wooden pews stretched in neat rows, worn smooth by decades of use. She sank onto one, the cool surface grounding her. Her hands rested on the back of the pew in front of her. She bowed her head, not in prayer, but in search of stillness. From her bag, she pulled a sheet of paper and a pen. Slowly, she wrote, "To the Board of Directors. I resign my position effective immediately." The words came easily, like water slipping downhill. She stared at them, her throat tight. But when her hand moved to sign her name, it stopped. She folded the paper once, twice, and tucked it back into her planner. Her chest rose and fell with a long breath. Resignation might protect her pride, but it would leave the bridge unfinished. She sat in silence, the chapel's hush wrapping around her like a blanket. That evening, as the halls grew quiet, Grant sought her out, but not in his corner office, with its glass walls and view of the city. Instead, he stood waiting outside the family consult room near the ER. The door stood open, the chairs inside arranged in a circle, worn by the weight of families who had sat there through long nights of waiting. "Can we talk here?" he asked, his voice low. Nora nodded. For the first time, the conversation would not be about binders or budgets, but about what truth and dignity demanded: no walls, no microphones, just two people sitting in a room that knew grief, honesty, and the courage to keep going, Armor is forged in grief, not greed. The family consult room was quiet, its walls soft with muted colors. A box of tissues sat in the center of the low table. The chairs, worn and plain, had held families through moments of waiting that stretched longer than hours. Grant didn't sit right away. He walked once around the circle, hands tucked into his pockets, shoulders tight. His usual polish was gone, the tie was gone too, his collar open. Finally, he lowered himself into a chair across from Nora, his gaze fixed on the floor. When he spoke, his voice carried no authority, no sharp edge. It was low, almost careful. It was a winter night. I was 21. My mother collapsed at home, shortness of breath, chest pain. We called for help, but the nearest ER had been closed in a consolidation. Efficiency, they called it. Services streamlined into the larger hospital 2 counties over. Nora sat very still. It was snowing. The roads were bad. The ambulance tried, but every mile was slower than the one before. She died before we got there. His jaw tightened, but his eyes did not lift. A delay. That's all it was. A few miles. A closed unit. A decision made by people who never had to sit on the floor of a cold ambulance while their mother's hand went slack in theirs. The silence stretched, heavy as the snow he described. I told myself then, he went on, that I'd build something different, stronger, more efficient, no waste, no slack in the system. I studied finance, mastered numbers, built models. Efficiency became my religion, because I believed if I could cut every delay, tighten every line, no one else would sit where I sat. He finally looked up, his eyes pale and hard. But efficiency is not the same as care. I forgot that. Or maybe I avoided it. Numbers are easier to carry than grief. Nora's hands rested against her planner in her lap. She felt the weight of his words, heavy as the chapel hush she'd left behind. That's the flaw in me, Grant said simply. Confusing efficiency with compassion. It's easier to hide in charts than to face the mess of human need. Easier to stay armored than risk seeing what I lost. He leaned back in the chair, exhaling slowly. His gaze softened, just slightly. You broke through that, with your binder, with your stubborn insistence, with coffee, of all things. You reminded me that efficiency isn't the point. It was never supposed to be about protecting margins. It was supposed to be about protecting mothers, fathers, neighbors. Nora swallowed, her throat tight. I know I've been arrogant, he said. That arrogance was a shield, the only way I knew to keep the grief from flooding through. But I see now it's not strength, it's blindness. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped. So, I'm saying this plain. I will back the revised plan publicly. I will stand in front of the board, in front of donors, in front of the state review, and say it's the right thing. Even if they walk away, even if I lose allies I've leaned on for years. Nora's breath caught. The words were clear, firm, without decoration, not sentimental, not softened, a man making a choice he could no longer avoid. Grant's voice lowered again. If they call me reckless, fine. If they call me weak, fine. But I won't be the man who lets another mother die because we saved a line item instead of a life. He leaned back, closing his eyes briefly. Then he opened them and looked at her. And if you think I'm still blind, tell me. I'll listen this time. The room settled into quiet. Nora traced the grain of the wood under her fingertips. Her mind replayed the hallway whispers, the cruel caption under the blurry photo, the resignation letter folded in her planner. But alongside those images stood the ambulance clock, the casseroles in Pastor Jim's basement, the donor's reluctant nods when truth found a place among numbers. You're not blind, she said finally. Her voice was soft, but steady. Not anymore. His shoulders eased. For a long moment, they sat without words. The quiet of the consult room holding them both. The walls had heard grief before, raw and unfiltered. Tonight they held something different: accountability. A decision forged from brokenness. Nora closed her planner, setting it gently on the table. She didn't need to write this moment down. It was written already in the space between them. Grant straightened, his tone shifting back toward resolve. We have days left before the state arrives. The ER is preserved on paper, but it isn't law yet. We'll need every figure, every story, every voice. Nora nodded, side by side. For once, the words didn't sound like a compromise. They sounded like the truth. If care was the point, then budgets had to learn to serve it. The boardroom smelled of coffee and dry erase ink. Papers spread across the long table in neat stacks. Nora smoothed her planner open, each line of notes ready. Grant stood beside the whiteboard, sleeves rolled back, tie tucked into his pocket. Martha Ellison, the chair, tapped her pen once, calling the room to focus. One by one, the pieces of the plan were set in place. The overnight ER would remain open. Staffing was scaled to lean but safe levels, backed by cross-training shifts. Mobile clinics were mapped to mountain routes, vans scheduled like lifelines threading through valleys. Volunteer driver stipends were added, small payments to honor fuel and time, recognizing what goodwill could not sustain alone. Telehealth was reframed as bridge, not crutch used to extend care, never to excuse its absence. Vanity renovations, lobby upgrades, and decorative contracts were cut, their dollars redirected to what kept people breathing. Each point was written in firm lines across the board. The plan was no longer a sketch. It stood upright, lean but strong. When Tom Beck pushed back, Martha steadied the room. "These mobile routes are still costly," Tom said, flipping through spreadsheets with a trace of irritation. Martha lifted her gaze. "Costly? Yes. But we've found where you failed to list the drain in outside consulting contracts. Those omissions are now clear." Tom stiffened, color rising in his cheeks. Nora kept her eyes on her notes, though her pulse raced. Grant spoke evenly. "Every dollar has a job. The ones wasted on vanity or neglect are now reassigned. Care is the job." Martha nodded once, her presence anchoring the room. The board murmured among themselves, but no one challenged further. By afternoon, Nora and Grant rehearsed before the health authority review. The conference hall felt cavernous, its acoustics too sharp, each word bouncing like a test. Nora began with community impact. Her voice, once quiet, carried steady. She spoke of icy switchbacks timed in ambulances, of church basements filled with casseroles and pill bottles, of fatigue written on caregivers' faces. She kept sentences plain, each story tethered to lives, not charts. Grant followed with numbers. He showed sustainability, cost cuts balanced against efficiency gains that mattered. He spoke not of profit margins, but of reduced readmissions, longer patient stability, and the fiscal strength of prevention over repair. Together, their voices wove a single thread: compassion married to reason, dignity bound to sustainability. For the first time in weeks, Nora noticed the whispers quiet. Staff passing in the hall still glanced, but with less suspicion, more curiosity. The low hum of doubt had softened. The true test came in the health authority review itself. Officials in dark suits sat stiffly at the long table, eyes scanning binders, pens tapping. They listened, asked questions, pressed on details. Nora answered when community need was raised. Grant took the fiscal heat. They moved as one, passing the focus back and forth, never overlapping, never fumbling. Then came the last-minute question. How will you guarantee funding for winter routes if donations drop? The official's voice was cool, pointed. The room held its breath. Grant didn't glance at Nora. He didn't stall. He stepped forward and spoke plainly. "We cut where pride lives. No new executive offices, no decorative contracts. We strip every dollar not tied to patient survival. Winter routes will stand first." The answer was clear, not polished, not wrapped in jargon, just a line drawn in firm ink. Nora felt the words settle deep, heavier than any slide or chart. It was a public declaration of a man changing his code. The review ended with nods, not verdicts. Decisions would come later. For now, the plan was on record, tested, and left standing. Nora closed her planner, hands steady at last. Grant gathered his papers without flourish, only focus. But when they left the hall, they did not return to the boardroom. They walked side by side down the long corridor, past the cafeteria, past the chatter, until they reached the chapel. Inside, the air was cool and hushed. Wooden pews stretched quietly, sunlight spilling soft across the floor. They sat in silence, not speaking, the weight of waiting pressing between them. The boardroom was for debate. The chapel was for truth. And now, they waited for an answer that would decide whether the bridge they had built would hold through the winter. Hope did not roar. It clicked on like fluorescence at dawn, steady and quiet. The letter from the State Health Authority arrived on a gray morning, the envelope thick, its seal crisp. Martha broke it open at the board table, her hands firm though her expression gave nothing away. She read aloud, her voice clear, each syllable striking like a gavel. Provisional approval. Conditions outlined. Final review in 12 months. Relief swept the room in a low exhale. Not a cheer, not a rush of applause, just shoulders sinking, eyes closing, hands unclenching. The ER would remain open through winter. The vans could begin their routes. The work was not over, but the bridge had been judged sound enough to stand. Donors who had wavered returned, some cautious, some quietly apologetic. Their pledges came with caveats, but they came nonetheless. Staff scheduling steadied. The lists on whiteboards grew clearer. Night coverage was patched with fewer gaps. Ride vouchers rolled out in neat stacks at the reception desk, ready to be handed to patients who had no other way to reach appointments. Nora walked the halls with her planner tucked under her arm. For once, she wasn't invisible. Nurses stopped her with questions, not dismissals. Volunteers nodded in greeting. Even Tom offered clipped acknowledgments, his objections muted. Each detail mattered. She made her rounds, noting where shifts needed relief, where drivers required fuel cards, where communication still stumbled. The binder she had once carried alone was now spread across desks, its ideas translated into schedules and actions. One afternoon, Martha asked her to step into a side office. The chairwoman's eyes, kind but steady, studied her with a weight Nora felt down to her bones. "The board would like you to consider a new position," Martha said. "Director of Community Integration. You've proven you understand how numbers and lives intersect. We need that understanding in leadership, not just in the margins." The words sank in slowly. Director, Community Integration. A title that would mean stepping fully out of the shadows, claiming a place she had never imagined hers. Nora thought of the long years of silence, the times her headshake had been ignored, the humiliations tucked behind thin smiles. She thought of how invisibility had once felt safer than risk. Now, the safety was gone, but so was the silence. She asked for time to think. Martha nodded, patient, knowing. In the days that followed, she carried the offer like a stone in her pocket, weighty, undeniable, impossible to forget. She turned it over in her mind during ambulance drills, during chapel quiet, during late-night review of schedules. Stepping forward would mean permanence, visibility, accountability. It would mean the whispers might never fade completely. But it would also mean her voice had roots now, not just wings. Grant never asked her directly what she would decide, but his respect showed in smaller ways. He no longer corrected her in meetings. He asked her opinion before offering his. When numbers clashed with stories, he let her words stand. One morning, she arrived to find a fresh coffee on her desk. The cup was warm, the lid secured, no stain spreading across paper or floor, no words attached, no note, just the gesture itself, quiet and deliberate. She smiled, a small curve of lips, and took a sip. There was no twist left to come, only the quiet of earned work. Patients filled the halls, vans rumbled onto mountain roads, pastors kept their sign-up sheets on corkboards, now linked to official schedules. Volunteers received small stipends and envelopes that carried dignity as much as dollars. The hospital hummed with cautious hope. Nora's planner, once heavy with ignored notes, was now full of check marks. Tasks completed, projects moving, conditions met. One evening, she paused at the doorway of the ER. The lights glowed steady, monitors beeping softly, nurses moving with purpose. The unit was alive, not shuttered, not dark. She stood a moment longer, letting the sight steady her. Then she turned back toward the stairs, toward the whiteboards and schedules and unending work. The bridge was not finished. It never would be. But it held. For now. And that was enough. When dawn came the next morning, the fluorescents flicked on in the lobby, pale light spilling across tile. Nora walked in with her planner and her steady stride. The day ahead would bring new demands, new arguments, new compromises, but it would also bring care, visible and steady. Grant passed her in the hallway, nodding once, no words needed. Respect had no label now. The work itself was the point. And as she sipped her coffee, warm in her hands, she let herself breathe in the simple truth. Hope does not roar. It begins quiet, like light returning after a long night. Sometimes the hardest walls we face are not built of stone or steel, but of silence. Nora's story reminds us that dignity is not granted by titles, but by the courage to speak when it matters most. For years, she stayed invisible, believing that careful work would speak for itself. Yet change only began when she risked being seen, when she refused to let arrogance drown out compassion. And Grant's journey shows that even power and wealth cannot protect us from old grief. His armor of efficiency was not strength, but fear. Only when he chose to listen, really listen, did healing begin, both for himself and for the community he served. The lesson is simple, but profound. Courage and humility are two sides of the same bridge. We need both to cross from what is broken to what can be rebuilt. In our own lives, we may not run hospitals or face microphones, but we all know moments when silence feels safer than truth. Nora's step forward invites us to ask what lives, what relationships, what hopes might be saved if we speak with honesty, and if we dare to listen with grace. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey. We hope Nora and Grant's story inspired you and touched your heart. If you enjoyed this story, please give us a like, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any of our future shining stories. Your support helps us continue sharing tales that uplift, inspire, and remind us of the power of courage and compassion.